So, during the pandemic, my friend Madi and I ran a monthly virtual event called PowerPoint Party where we get to present on anything and everything. Here is my presentation on the labor strikes of the late 1800s. It is 1891 and people are pissed. This is the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to call it the Tennessee Coal Company. They were the primary lessee of state convict labor. And in 1891, stockades burned to the ground and 500 convicts were freed. But how did we get here? What happened? Let's rewind. In 1865, the Civil War ended. And in June 19th, the final remaining enslaved people were freed. A couple things I wanted to mention about this time. So after the Civil War ends, we mysteriously see a sharp rise in black inmates in the prison system. Lots of arrests were made, but we're going to keep a pin in that and come back to that. It also marked the age of industrialization. Steam and electricity led way to new innovations in farming technology that made farming more efficient, more effective. And the effects of industrialization meant that this eliminated jobs on farms. This meant that farmers lost land and property. This also drove farmers to the cities for factory jobs. So during this age, there were no regulations. There was no OSHA, and there's no 40-hour cap on a work week. There's no breaks. Companies just did not have to do that. And these companies got greedy. So no labor regulations and an abundance of workers meant that this opened up the American people to severe abuse. People worked such long hours that their own families became strangers to them. Here is an excerpt from a poem that was written during this time. Ere dawn, my labor drives me forth. 'Tis night when I am free. A stranger am I to my child, a stranger my child to me. And here's an illustration of child laborers moving coal through these tiny, thin tunnels underground. It was very dangerous. So then gave rise to labor unions. During this time, the working class suffered such abuse and such dehumanization that they decided to fight back. Some of the biggest labor unions were the Knights of Labor, Central Labor Union, and the American Federation of Labor. And what these labor unions would do was they would consistently organize strikes. But if you were a greedy company and you didn't want to treat your workers better or pay them more, how does a company break a strike? Well, they can break them by hiring women, by hiring immigrants, black workers, children, convict labor. There's always cheap labor. The pyramid of oppression assured that cheaper labor was always available. Labor unions knew this. So some, but not all, did work with women and black workers, and some groups, like the Knights of Labor, even had black workers and women in their leadership. Hey, Editor Havana here. I just want to chime in and say this is the limitation of having to cram so much history into 10 minutes. I do not mean to make it sound like everything was all peace and rainbows here with the labor unions. There was still rampant sexism and racism within the labor unions themselves. And of course, there were also women-only labor unions, black labor unions. And even though those labor unions were working with black workers and women, they were still really shitty to Chinese immigrants, for example. And for some reason, they just never collaborate with them, even though Chinese immigrants were also used to break strikes. Anyways, don't get the impression that everything was all hunky-dory back then. But my point here was that surprisingly, labor unions were working with these other groups. Just wanted to chime in and clarify that because I think it would be irresponsible not to do that. Anyways, moving on. Remember the Tennessee Coal Company? They screwed over their workers a lot. They cut their wages, they paid in scripts, which basically means they paid their workers in gift cards, And they cheated these workers out of their pay because these workers were being paid per pound of coal that they would mine. But the people regulating the weighing of the coal was, you guessed it, the Tennessee Coal Company. So you can imagine the numbers were a little off. The Tennessee Coal Company also became the primary lessee of convict labor in the States. So this led to a lot of strikes, which just brought down the wages and just killed the leverage that the coal miners had. So on July 5th of 1891, miners stormed in, supported by local shopkeepers. You can imagine that the miners are actually a big economic core of the town. And so these shopkeepers were also hurting if their biggest customer base was also not getting paid. So the whole town is salty at you. When that didn't work, a couple weeks later, 2,000 armed miners started a peaceful protest and a strike, which led to the company and the government saying, oh, okay, we'll fix it, we promise. Well, actually, it just led to the governor gaining more power to mobilize militias to actually protect greedy companies like this. So, as you can imagine, these workers were pissed. So, that Halloween in 1891, the miners got impatient and 1,000 of them organized to storm the stockades. Stockades were burned to the ground and 500 convicts were freed. But how was no one arrested? Here's the part that blows my mind. The leaders of the labor union quit 3 days before this. So now the leaders can say, hey, I didn't organize it. Also, remember the shopkeepers who were salty about these miners not getting paid? Well, there was also a mysterious large public dance gathering that was organized that night, which gave a lot of those workers an alibi. And the actual town helped them with their alibis. These workers also cut the telegraph line so that no open communication could get out. The workers also prepared folded clothes so that when the convicts were freed, they could throw off their uniforms and quickly change into the new clothes so they can't get caught. They also chose a night where the sheriff was just conveniently out of office. This was very controversial, as you can imagine, but it inspired a lot of similar strikes, many more attacks, a lot more property damage, and that December of the same year, Tennessee became the first southern state to stop using convict labor. I honestly love this story because it's an example of how when people get together and unify and really fight against an oppressor, they can actually win. We honestly owe so much to the labor unions of the 1800s. Because of them, we get weekends. We get a 40-hour work week. We get 8-hour shifts instead of the 10, 14-hour shifts. We get workers' comp, disability comp, safety regulations. And I highly encourage everyone to read up about the history of labor unions in the U.S. Some of the sources that I used for this presentation include Howard Zinn's A People's History of the U.S. It's a thick one, but definitely check out the chapter Robber Barons and Rebels. I also have a couple more links on this particular strike, and these will all be in the description. And thanks for joining me on a very interesting and weird and cool story. But seriously, read about it. It's very fascinating. Thank you.